everybody, welcome to Ryan's Room, a show where I find stuff around my apartment and talk to you about them in a sciencey way. So, just before we really get started here, just one little production note. We decided at HSC, me and some of the other folks on this sort of social media YouTube video team, decided that sort of a better way going forward for us would probably be to start making more but shorter videos. So rather than having the 20 plus minute episodes of Ryan's Room that we've had for the last couple, going forward they're probably going to be shorter, more in the 5 to 10 minute range, and I'm going to try and get them out a little bit more regularly. And it ends up being a good fit for this next item. This is actually an item that I had planned on shooting for the first episode of Ryan's Room, but was kind of struggling with it as far as finding a specific topic that I wanted to talk about in regards to this item. When I do Ryan's Room, I try and sort of contain it to one or two little topics, and this is one that is so big and so broad that like I said, I was struggling to figure out a way to turn it into one video. But with this move over to shorter videos, now I don't have to, because now I can turn it into a bunch of little shorter, 5 to 10 minute videos, and I think it's going to be a great fit for this item. And so what we have today is the Pokemon Master Trainer board game. And this is a board game put out by Milton Bradley and Hasbro. I don't know exactly when. It's only got the first generation of Pokemon in it, so I would assume it's sometime before 2000, sometime in the late 90s. And I remember as a kid being aware of the existence of this board game, but never actually playing it. I was a big fan of Pokemon as a kid, still am to this day. But I remember wanting to play this board game and never getting an opportunity to. So I got this game maybe a year and a half ago. Maybe 2 years ago at this point almost. There's a Goodwill that is right next to the Headwaters Science Center. I walk past it every day, leaving and going to work. And so I'll swing in there every once in a while just to see if there's anything worth scooping up, anything interesting in there. And I just happened to notice it was in there one day for apparently $3, sticker's still on it. And like I said, it's a game that I had wanted to play ever since I was a kid and never gotten an opportunity to. Turns out the copy I bought is actually missing several pieces, so I still to this day have not played it. But I've gone through and read reviews of it, and apparently it's not a very good game, is what the general consensus seems to be. It sounds like it's really, really, really hard, even if you know your stuff about Pokemon. So I'm probably not missing out on much, but I would still enjoy the opportunity to try and play it at some point. And just for all of you who are thinking, because I know all you fans out there are probably thinking, formula for Ryan's Room up to now has been one item per episode, and now he's going to do several episodes on one item. Don't worry, this isn't going to be specifically about the board game. It's going to be sort of a pan-Pokemon topic, and I have plenty of other Pokemon merch if you need me to come up with a new item for every episode. I got you covered. So we're going to be talking about a whole slew of different biology concepts, because sort of as they pertain to Pokemon and as that compares to similar concepts in the real world. But for this first episode, I think in particular, we're going to be talking specifically about species concept. And so what I mean when I say that is I want to talk about how we in the real world decide if two individuals are of the same species or if they are of separate species, and how that compares to how that is done within the Pokemon world. Quick interjection here. It occurs to me that everybody out there listening might not know what Pokemon is or what it is about, so the first Pokemon property was a video game that came out in 1996. The premise of that game is that you live in a world where, rather than having animals, instead what they have are creatures called Pokemon. Your role in the game is you are assisting a Pokemon professor, a scientist, someone who studies Pokemon, with their research, and so what you are tasked with doing is to capture an individual of every single type of Pokemon to fill out this sort of encyclopedia that the professor is making. There's a lot more to it than that, but sort of the core idea that is important for this video is that Pokemon are basically animals, and your role in the game is to assist someone who is basically a biologist with their research. Alright, now that that's out of the way, let's define some species. So, the model that I'm sure most of you are familiar with is commonly referred to as the biological species concept, and it's one that was developed in the 1940s or so, 30s or 40s, by a biologist by the name of Ernst Mayr. And it's a model where species is defined by the ability of individuals to reproduce with one another to the exclusion of other individuals. If individual A and individual B are able to reproduce with one another and produce a child who is then also able to reproduce, then we would say that individual A and individual B are then the same species. So two different breeds of horse would be considered the same species because they make a baby horse that would then also be able to reproduce. But you would say a horse and a donkey are two different species because, yes, horses and donkeys are able to reproduce, but the resulting baby, a mule, is sterile. A mule is not able to reproduce. And then, of course, a horse and a deer would be considered two separate species because a horse and a deer are not able to produce any offspring at all. This is the species definition that I was taught in school, and I talked to a few of my coworkers of varying ages, and what I've gathered is that this is the definition that is still being taught in schools to this day, and has been getting taught for at least several decades at this point. And before I start picking this model apart, I just want to preface this by saying I don't think it's a bad model. I think it is a good model for people who are not biologists. It is functional for what most people need a model of species to be functional for. But once you start getting into a little bit more advanced biology, start getting into the academia a little bit, it kind of falls apart because there's a number of situations where this model either doesn't work outright or there's just so many question marks around it that it becomes a not very functional model. One of the most glaring shortcomings of this model is it doesn't account for things that reproduce asexually. So think about something like a bacteria, where two bacteria don't reproduce and make a new bacteria. One bacteria just splits in half and becomes two bacteria. And so without that interaction where you need two individuals that then produce a third individual, this model doesn't really account for how you would say that two bacteria are of the same species. The other thing that this model doesn't really account for is individuals who are just unable to reproduce for, whatever reason. Being sterile would be the most obvious thing that jumps out here as an example of something that this model doesn't really account for. We can also think of it in the context of different life phases. So a lot of creatures, a lot of animals specifically, go through a phase of their life where they are unable to reproduce when they are very young. But some animals, as they get older, also go through another phase where they are unable to reproduce towards the end of their life. And this model does not account for that because it is based on the ability to reproduce. Geography could also be a factor here, where you could have two creatures that theoretically might be able to reproduce and produce a viable young, but if one of them is on one side of the world and one of them is on the opposite side of the world and there's no real feasible way that they could encounter each other naturally, can we really say that they're the same species because there's really no chance that they would actually be able to reproduce? And then you have time as another factor. And for me, as someone whose background is in biological anthropology, this is probably the hardest one for me to reconcile with this model. So in this model, it could be argued that a horse that is born today is a different species than a horse that died yesterday, because those two horses never would have had an opportunity to interbreed. And I hate to tear down a model without providing one that is more functional, but the truth is with species, there really isn't one. This is a topic that's been debated forever. I mean, you can go back and there's Greek philosophy that's talking about this. Fast forward all the way up into Darwin's works, and he's talking about it and sort of lamenting the fact that there's not a very good definition and considers the definitions of the time to be very arbitrary. And then obviously you get into the 1900s and you're dealing with Meyer's model that we're still talking about to this day and what this video up to now has been largely about. Most modern models of species have kind of abandoned it as a concept altogether. It's sort of just acknowledging that species isn't real. It's arbitrary groupings that humans have created because we like to categorize things. And so instead of seeing like a single, broad, sweeping, universally accepted model of species that just works across all of biology, instead what you see are sort of smaller, situationally applicable models. And this is why I say that the Myers model isn't a bad model, because there are situations where it is directly applicable and very functional, and this is why it's still the model that gets taught in schools. We were talking about horses earlier, so it's a model that would be very applicable for a horse breeder, because it tells you that if you breed your horse with another horse, you're going to get one outcome, and if you breed your horse with a donkey, you're going to get a different outcome, and if you breed your horse with a deer, you're going to get another different outcome. And this model accounts for that, and for that horse breeder, that's all he needs. So we've talked a lot about species concept as it applies to the real world. Now let's shift gears and move over to see if we can't take some of these concepts and apply them to the Pokemon world. And one thing that we have within the world of Pokemon that is really convenient and is going to help us here is the Pokedex. The Pokedex is that encyclopedia that I mentioned earlier that you are trying to fill out for the Pokemon professor. And the Pokedex is great because it automatically updates. You don't need to decide what Pokemon are new and different from ones that you've seen before. The Pokedex sees something, it says, hey, this is new, this is different from anything I've seen before, this is a new entry. And so we have a built-in species definition right there. It's just a matter of figuring out what it is. The other convenient thing that is possible in the games is that Pokemon breeding is a thing. You can put two Pokemon together in a breeding center, and if they are compatible, they will produce a baby Pokemon. The fact that breeding and reproduction is a thing obviously opens the door to a potential biological species concept like we were talking about before, Ernst Mayr's model. So let's talk about Pokemon breeding. This is a Butterfree. Very common Pokemon, one that a lot of people playing the game will probably encounter very early in their journey. Let's run a couple of tests with a Butterfree and a couple of different potential mates, and see what the outcomes are, and see how the Pokedex treats those outcomes. First, let's just try pairing a Butterfree with another Butterfree, and as you can see, the outcome here is what is called a Caterpie, and that makes a lot of sense. A Caterpie is basically the baby form of a Butterfree. A Caterpie will eventually grow into a Butterfree. And we can sort of think of this as our control in this experiment. And what a control is a test that you run to establish what is the baseline expectation for what is going to happen. And so when you do further experiments, run further tests, what you're looking for is differences from your control. So now let's swap out that Butterfree for a different Pokemon. In this case, an Aerodactyl. And an Aerodactyl is a Pokemon that the game recognizes as being distinct from a Butterfree. And so now if we try and breed our Aerodactyl with our Butterfree, the end result is that no baby is produced. And so far, Mayr's model, the biological species concept, seems to be holding up. An Aerodactyl and a Butterfree cannot reproduce, and they are treated as separate species. But it never hurts to run more tests, so let's swap out that Aerodactyl for another different Pokemon. How about something kind of insect-like, sort of like our Butterfree is? This is a pincer. And when our Butterfree and our pincer breed together, what we actually end up getting is a pincer. And this is kind of interesting because we did get a baby, and this is a pincer that, for all intents and purposes, is the same as the pincer that was one of its parents, but it's a different outcome than what we got when we bred two Butterfrees together. And why this happens is that the Butterfree that we put into our hypothetical here, I said was a male Butterfree, and I said that the pincer that we put into this hypothetical was a female. So when you take a male Butterfree and a female pincer, you end up with a pincer as the baby. And if you swap the sexes around, if you do a female Butterfree with a male pincer, the opposite happens and you do get the Caterpie. So the same thing that we got when we bred our two Butterfrees together. And the game does treat pincer and Butterfree as being different species. And so now that we have some new information, we now need to update our model. So our model up till now was that if a baby was produced, then we say that the two parents are of the same species, and if a baby wasn't produced, we can say that the parents are of different species. Now that we know that Butterfree and pincer are able to reproduce, but are still considered different, we have to account for that. So now we have to add part of our model that says, if you swap the sexes of the parents and get different outcomes, we say that the parents are different species. Let's run one more test here. This time let's pair our Butterfree with a Caterpie. And as we've seen in our previous tests, a Caterpie is a baby Butterfree. And the outcome of this pairing, regardless of the sexes of the parents, whether it's male Butterfree and female Caterpie, or female Butterfree and male Caterpie, is a Caterpie. So it's the same outcome that we saw when we mated two Butterfrees together. And so what our model would tell us is that Butterfree and Caterpie are the same species. And like I said, that makes a lot of sense because Caterpie eventually becomes Butterfree. But, strangely enough, Pokedex actually treats Caterpie and Butterfree as being different species. And this is sort of something we talked about when we were talking about Mayr's model in the real world, where we said that it has some issues when accounting for different life phases of real-world animals. But that's not the same issue here because Caterpie is capable of reproducing, whereas a real-life caterpillar is not able to. So the only real conclusion I can draw here is that the Pokedex isn't using anything even really resembling the biological species concept when it's deciding what two individuals are of different species. So that of course begs the question of what is the definition it is using? And I think a different Pokemon can give us a little clue to that. These are Nidorans. The purple one is the male, the blue one is the female. They are fully capable of breeding with one another, and the resulting baby can be either one, either the purple or the blue one. And the game actually recognizes them as being different species too. And Nidoran are unique in that, at least in the older games, they were the only Pokemon that exhibited sexual dimorphism. And sexual dimorphisms are physical differences between the males and females of a species. So you could think of like a deer as an example. The males have antlers, the females don't. Or how the males and females of a lot of species of birds will be different colors. And I think what this tells us is that the Pokedex is using what we would call a phenotypic model to define its species. And what this means is that it is defining species by physical traits. It's basically saying, if these two things look enough alike, they must be the same thing. And this is something that people sometimes do in the real world too. It's generally not considered to be a very useful model, but people still do it sometimes. And the obvious shortcoming of it is that there can be a lot of variation within a single species. So you can think of something like dogs, for example, where a pug and a Great Dane look very different from one another, but are still considered to be the same species generally. And the same but opposite problem is that you can have two animals that are different that look very, very similar to one another. So a good example would be the coral snake and the milk snake, where they look very similar to each other, but the coral snake is a dangerous, venomous snake and the milk snake isn't. The coral snake and the milk snake look a lot more like each other than the Great Dane and the pug do, but you would be hard-pressed to find anybody who would say that the milk snake and the coral snake are the same species, but the Great Dane and the pug are not. And this is why it's a model that isn't very widely used, at least in the real world. In the Pokemon world, seems like it works out fine. So I think that's going to do it for this episode of Ryan's Room. That episode ended up going on a little bit longer than I kind of expected to going in, but I think that's okay. We laid a good solid groundwork that we're going to be able to build off of going forward here. So the next few episodes are all going to be Pokemon related, so if you're interested in that, make sure that you're following us on all of our various social medias. That's Facebook, that's Instagram, and that's YouTube. Otherwise, yeah, just thanks for watching, guys. Bye-bye.